The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 11, Side 1. Hideyoshi being dead, Ieyasu pointed out that he had drawn the blood for his oath, not from his finger or his gums, as the code of the samurai required, but from a scratch behind his ear, hence the oath was not binding. He overwhelmed the forces of certain rival leaders at Sekigahara, in a battle that left 40,000 dead. He tolerated Hideyori till his coming of age made him dangerous, and then suggested to him the wisdom of submission. Rebuked, he besieged the gigantic castle of Osaka, where Hideyori was established, captured it while the youth committed harakiri, and ensured his hold upon power by killing all of Hideyori's children, legitimate and illegitimate. Then Ieyasu organized peace as ably and ruthlessly as he had organized war, and administered Japan so well that it was content to be ruled by his posterity and his principles for 8 generations. He was a man of his own ideas and made his morals as he went along. When a very presentable woman came to him with the complaint that one of his officials had killed her husband in order to possess her, Ieyasu ordered the official to disembowel himself and made the lady his concubine. Like Socrates, he ranked wisdom as the only virtue, and charted some of its paths in that strange legacy or intellectual testament which he bequeathed to his family at his death. Life is like unto a long journey with a heavy burden. Let thy step be slow and steady, that thou stumble not. Persuade thyself that imperfection and inconvenience is the natural lot of mortals, and there will be no room for discontent, neither for despair. When ambitious desires arise in thy heart, recall the days of extremity thou hast passed through. Forbearance is the root of quietness and assurance forever. Look upon wrath as thy enemy. If thou knowest only what it is to conquer, and knowest not what it is to be defeated, woe unto thee. It will fare ill with thee. Find fault with thyself rather than with others. Having captured power by arms, he decided that Japan had no need of further war, and devoted himself to furthering the ways and virtues of peace. To win the samurai from the habits of the sword, he encouraged them to study literature and philosophy, and to contribute to the arts, and under the rule which he established, culture flourished in Japan and militarism decayed. The people, he wrote, are the foundation of the empire, and he invoked the special commiseration of his successors for the widower, the widowed, the orphaned, and the lonely. But he had no democratic predispositions. The greatest of all crimes, he thought, was insubordination. A fellow who stepped out of his rank was to be cut down on the spot, and the entire family of a rebel should be put to death. The feudal order, in his judgment, was the best that could be devised for actual human beings. It provided a rational balance between central and local power. It established a natural and hereditary system of social and economic organization, and it preserved the continuity of a society without subjecting it to despotic authority. It must be admitted that Ieyasu organized the most perfect form of feudal government ever known. Like most statesmen, he thought of religion chiefly as an organ of social discipline, and regretted that the variety of human beliefs canceled half this good by the disorder of hostile creeds. To his completely political mind, the traditional faith of the Japanese people, a careless mixture of Shintoism and Buddhism, was an invaluable bond, cementing the race into spiritual unity, moral order, and patriotic devotion. And though at first he approached Christianity with the lenient eye and broad intelligence of Akbar, and refrained from enforcing against it the angry edicts of Hideyoshi, he was disturbed by its intolerance, its bitter denunciation of the native faith as idolatry, and the discord which its passionate dogmatism aroused not only between the converts and the nation, but among the neophytes themselves. Finally, his resentment was stirred by the discovery that missionaries sometimes allowed themselves to be used as vanguards for conquerors, and were here and there conspiring against the Japanese state. In 1614 he forbade the practice or preaching of the Christian religion in Japan, and ordered all converts either to depart from the country or to renounce their new beliefs. Many priests evaded the decree, and some of them were arrested. None was executed during the lifetime of Ieyasu, but after his death the fury of the bureaucrats was turned against the Christians, and a violent and brutal persecution ensued which practically stamped Christianity out of Japan. In 1638 the remaining Christians gathered to the number of 37,000 on the peninsula of Shimabara, fortified it, and made a last stand for the freedom of worship. Iemitsu, grandson of Ieyasu, sent a large armed force to subdue them. When, after a 3 months' siege, their stronghold was taken, all but 105 of the survivors were massacred in the streets. Ieyasu and Shakespeare were contemporaries in death. The doughty shogun left his power to his son Hidetada with a simple admonition: take care of the people, strive to be virtuous, never neglect to protect the country. And to the nobles who stood at his deathbed, he left advice in the best tradition of Confucius and Mencius. My son has now come of age. I feel no anxiety for the future of the state. But should my successor commit any grave fault in his administration, do you administer affairs yourselves. The country is not the country of one man, but the country of the nation. If my descendants lose their power because of their misdeeds, I shall not regret it. His descendants conducted themselves much better than monarchs can usually be expected to behave over a great length of time. Hidetada was a harmless mediocrity. Ieyasu represented a stronger mood of the stock and sternly suppressed a movement to restore to actual power the still reigning but not ruling emperors. Tsunayoshi lavished patronage upon men of letters and on the great rival schools of painting, Kano and Tosa, that embellished the Genroku age, 1688 to 1703. Yoshimune set himself to the ever-recurrent purpose of abolishing poverty, at the very time when his treasury faced an unusual deficit. He borrowed extensively from the merchant class, attacked the extravagance of the rich, and stoically reduced the expenditures of his government, even to the extent of dismissing the 50 fairest ladies of the court. He dressed in cotton cloth, slept on a peasant's pallet, and dined on the simplest fare. He had a complaint box placed before the palace of the Supreme Court, and invited the people to submit criticisms of any governmental policy or official. When one Yamashita sent in a caustic indictment of his whole administration, Yoshimune had the document read aloud in public and rewarded the author for his candor with a substantial gift. It was the judgment of Lafcadio Hearn that the Tokugawa period was the happiest in the long life of the nation. History, though it can never quite know the past, inclines tentatively to the same conclusion. How could one, seeing Japan today, suspect that on those now excited islands, only a century ago, lived a people poor but content, enjoying a long epoch of peace under the rule of a military class, and pursuing in quiet isolation the highest aims of literature and art? Chapter 29. The Political and Moral Foundations. A Tentative Approach. If, now, we try to picture the Japan that died in 1853, we should remember that it may be as hard to understand as it might be to fight a people 5,000 miles distant, and differing from us in color and language, government and religion, manners and morals, character and ideals, literature and art. Hearn was more intimate with Japan than any other Western writer of his time, and yet he spoke of the immense difficulty of perceiving and comprehending what underlies the surface of Japanese life. Your information about us, a genial Japanese essayist reminds the Occident, is based on the meager translations of our immense literature, if not on the unreliable anecdotes of passing travelers. We Asiatics are often appalled by the curious web of facts and fancies which has been woven concerning us. We are pictured as living on the perfume of the lotus, if not on mice and cockroaches. What follows, therefore, is a tentative approach, based on the briefest direct acquaintance, to Japanese civilization and character. Each student must correct it by long and personal experience. The first lesson of philosophy is that we may all be mistaken. 1. The samurai. The powerless emperor, the powers of the shogun, the sword of the samurai, the code of the samurai, harakiri, the 47 ronin, a commuted sentence. Theoretically, at the head of the nation was the divine emperor. The actually ruling house, the hereditary shogunate, allowed the emperor and his court $25,000 a year for maintaining the impressive and useful fiction of uninterrupted rule. This sum, however, was probably equivalent to $250,000 in current American money. Many people of the court practiced some domestic handicraft to sustain themselves. Some made umbrellas, others made chopsticks or toothpicks or playing cards. The Tokugawa shoguns made it a principle to leave the emperor no authority whatever, to seclude him from the people, to surround him with women, and to weaken him with effeminacy and idleness. The imperial family yielded its powers gracefully and contented itself with dictating the fashions of aristocratic dress. Meanwhile, the shogun luxuriated in the slowly growing wealth of Japan and assumed prerogatives normally belonging to the emperor. When he was borne through the streets in his ox carriage or palanquin, the police required every house along the route and all the shutters of the upper windows to be closed. All fires were to be extinguished, all dogs and cats were to be locked up, and the people themselves were to kneel by the roadside with their heads upon their hands and their hands upon the ground. The shogun had a large personal retinue, including 4 jesters and 8 cultured ladies dedicated to entertain him without reserve. He was advised by a cabinet of 12 members, a great senior, 5 seniors or ministers, and 6 sub-elders, who formed a junior council. As in China, a board of censors supervised all administrative offices and kept watch upon the feudal lords. These lords, or daimyo, great name, formally acknowledged allegiance only to the emperor. Some of them, like the Shimadzu family that ruled Satsuma, successfully limited the shogun's authority and finally overthrew it. Below the lords were the baronets, and below these the squires, and serving the lords were 1 million or more samurai, sword-bearing guardsmen. The basic principle of Japanese feudal society was that every gentleman was a soldier and every soldier a gentleman. Here lay the sharpest difference between Japan and that Pacific China, which thought that every gentleman should be a scholar rather than a warrior. Though they loved and partly formed themselves on such swashbuckling novels as the Chinese Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the samurai scorned mere learning and called the literary savant a book-smelling sot. They had many privileges. They were exempt from taxation, received a regular stipend of rice from the baron whom they served, and performed no labor except occasionally to die for their country. They looked down upon love as a graceful game and preferred Greek friendship. They made a business of gambling and brawling and kept their swords in condition by paying the executioner to let them cut off condemned heads. His sword, in Ieyasu's famous phrase, was the soul of the samurai, and found remarkably frequent expression despite prolonged national peace. He had the right, according to Ieyasu, to cut down at once any member of the lower classes who offended him, and when his steel was new and he wished to make a trial of it, he was as likely to try it on a beggar as on a dog. A famous swordsman having obtained a new sword, says Longford, took up his place by the Nihonbashi, the central bridge of Yedo, to await a chance of testing it. By and by a fat peasant came along, merrily drunk, and the swordsman dealt him the nashiwari, pear-splitter, so effectively that he cut him right through from the top of his head down to the fork. The peasant continued on his way, not knowing that anything had happened to him, till he stumbled against a coolie and fell in 2 neatly severed pieces. Of such trivial consequence is the difference, so troublesome to philosophers, between the one and the many. The samurai had other graces than this jolly dispatch with which they transformed time into eternity. They accepted a stern code of honor, Bushido, or the way of the knight, whose central theory was its definition of virtue. The power of deciding upon a certain course of conduct in accordance with reason, without wavering, to die when it is right to die, to strike when it is right to strike. They were tried by their own code, but it was more severe than the common law. They despised all material enterprise and gain, and refused to lend, borrow, or count money. They seldom broke a promise, and they risked their lives readily for anyone who appealed to them for just aid. They made a principle of hard and frugal living. They limited themselves to 1 meal a day, and accustomed themselves to eat any food that came to hand, and to hold it. They bore all suffering silently, and suppressed every display of emotion. Their women were taught to rejoice when informed that their husbands had been killed on the battlefield. They recognized no obligation except that of loyalty to their superiors. This was, in their code, a higher law than parental or filial love. It was a common thing for a samurai to disembowel himself on the death of his lord, in order to serve and protect him in the other world. When the shogun Iemitsu was dying in 1651, he reminded his prime minister, Hoto, of his duty of junshi, or following in death. Hoto killed himself without a word, and several subordinates imitated him. When the Emperor Mutsuhito went to his ancestors in 1912, General Nogi and his wife committed suicide in loyalty to him. Not even the traditions of Rome's finest soldiers bred greater courage, asceticism, and self-control than were demanded by the code of the samurai. The final law of Bushido was harakiri, suicide by disembowelment. The occasions when this would be expected of a samurai were almost beyond count, and the practice of it so frequent that little notice was taken of it. If a man of rank had been condemned to death, he was allowed, as an expression of the emperor's esteem, to cut through his abdomen from left to right and then down to the pelvis with the small sword which he always carried for this purpose. If he had been defeated in battle or had been compelled to surrender, he was as like as not to rip open his belly. Harakiri means belly cutting. It is a vulgar word, seldom used by the Japanese, who prefer to call it seppuku. When in 1895 Japan yielded to European pressure and abandoned Liaotung, 40 military men committed harakiri in protest. During the War of 1905, many officers and men in the Japanese Navy killed themselves rather than be captured by the Russians. If his superior did something offensive to him, the good samurai might gash himself to death at his master's gate. The art of seppuku, the precise ritual of ripping, was one of the first items in the education of samurai youth, and the last tribute of affection that could be paid to a friend was to stand by him and cut off his head as soon as he carved his paunch. Out of this training, and the traditions bound up with it, has come some part of the Japanese soldiers' comparative fearlessness of death. Harakiri was forbidden to women and plebeians, but women were allowed to commit jigaki. That is, they were permitted as a protest against an offense to pierce the throat with a dagger and to sever the arteries by a single thrust. Every woman of quality received technical training in the art of cutting her throat and was taught to bind her lower limbs together before killing herself, lest her corpse should be found in an immodest position. Murder, like suicide, was allowed occasionally to replace the law. Feudal Japan economized on policemen not only by having many bonzes, but by allowing the son or brother of a murdered man to take the law into his own hand. And this recognition of the right of revenge, though it begot half the novels and plays of Japanese literature, intercepted many crimes. The samurai, however, usually felt called upon to commit harakiri after exercising this privilege of personal revenge. When the famous 47 ronin, wave men, that is, unattached samurai, to avenge a death had cut off the head of Kotsuke no Suke, with supreme courtesy and the most refined apologies, they retired in dignity to estates named by the shogun and neatly killed themselves. 1703. Priests returned Kotsuke's head to his retainers, who gave them this simple receipt. Memorandum, item, 1 head. Item, 1 paper parcel. The above articles are acknowledged to have been received. Signed, Sayada Mogubai, Saito Kunai. This is probably the most famous and typical event in the history of Japan, and one of the most significant for the understanding of Japanese character. Its protagonists are still, in the popular view, heroes and saints. To this day, pious hands deck their graves, and incense never ceases to rise before their resting place. Towards the end of Ieyasu's regency, 2 brothers, Sakon and Naiki, 24 and 17 years of age respectively, tried to kill him because of wrongs which they felt he had inflicted upon their father. They were caught as they entered the camp and were sentenced to death. Ieyasu was so moved by their courage that he commuted their sentences to self-disembowelment, and in accord with the customs of the time he included their younger brother, the 8-year-old Hachimaro, in this merciful decree. The physician who attended the boys has left us a description of the scene. When they were all seated in a row for final dispatch, Sakon turned to the youngest and said, "Go thou first, for I wish to be sure that thou doest it right." Upon the little one's replying that, as he had never seen seppuku performed, he would like to see his brothers do it, and then he could follow them, the older brothers smiled between their tears. "Well said, little fellow. So canst thou well boast of being our father's child." When they had placed him between them, Sakon thrust the dagger into the left side of his abdomen and said, "Look, brother, dost understand now? Only don't push the dagger too far, lest thou fall back. Lean forward, rather, and keep thy knees well composed." Nike did likewise, and said to the boy, "Keep thine eyes open, or else thou mayest look like a dying woman. If thy dagger feels anything within and thy strength fails, take courage and double thy effort to cut across." The child looked from one to the other, and when both had expired, he calmly half-denuded himself and followed the example set him on either hand. 2. The law, the first code, group responsibility, punishments. The legal system of Japan was a vigorous supplement to private assassination and revenge. It had its origins partly in the ancient usages of the people, partly in the Chinese codes of the 7th century. Law accompanied religion in the migration of culture from China to Japan. Tenchi Tenno began the formulation of a system of laws which was completed and promulgated under the boy emperor Momu in 702. In the feudal epoch, this and other codes of the imperial age fell into disuse, and each fief legislated independently. The samurai recognized no law beyond the will and decrees of his daimyo. Until 1721, it was the custom of Japan to hold the entire family responsible for the good behavior of each member, and in most localities to charge each family in a group of 5 with responsibility for all. The grown sons of an adult who had been condemned to be crucified or burned were executed with him, and his younger sons, on coming of age, were banished. Ordeal was used in medieval trials, and torture remained popular in its milder forms till modern times. The Japanese used the rack on some Christians in vengeful imitation of the Inquisition, but more often their subtle minds were content to bind a man with ropes into a constrained position that became more agonizing with every minute. Whippings for trifling offenses were frequent, and death could be earned by anyone of a great variety of crimes. The Emperor Shomu, 724 to 756, abolished capital punishment and made compassion the rule of government, but crime increased after his death, and the Emperor Konin, 770 to 781, not only restored the death penalty, but decreed that thieves should be publicly scourged until they died. Capital punishment also took the form of strangling, beheading, crucifixion, quartering, burning, or boiling in oil. Ieyasu put an end to the old custom of pulling a condemned man in two between oxen, or binding him to a public post and inviting each passer-by to take a turn in cutting through him from shoulder to crotch with a saw. Ieyasu laid it down that the frequent resort to severe punishments proved not the criminality of the people so much as the corruption and incompetence of the officials. Yoshimune was disgusted to find that the prisons of his time had no sanitary arrangements, and that among the prisoners were several whose trials, though begun 16 years back, were still unfinished, so that the accusations against them were forgotten and the witnesses were dead. This practice was forbidden in 1699. This most enlightened of the shoguns reformed the prisons, improved and accelerated judicial procedure, abolished family responsibility, and labored sedulously for years to formulate the first unified code of Japanese feudal law, 1721. 3. The toilers, castes, an experiment in the nationalization of land, state fixing of wages, a famine, handicrafts, artisans, and guilds. In the imperial age, society had been divided into 8 sei, or castes. In the feudal epoch, these were softened into 4 classes: samurai, artisans, peasants, and merchants, the last being also, in social ranking, least. Beneath these classes was a large body of slaves, numbering some 5% of the population, and composed of criminals, war captives, or children seized and sold by kidnappers, or children sold into slavery by their parents. Lower even than these slaves was a caste of pariahs known as eta, considered despicable and unclean by Buddhist Japan because they acted as butchers, tanners, and scavengers. The great bulk of the population, which numbered in Yoshimune's days some 30 millions, was composed of peasant proprietors, intensively cultivating that 1/8 of Japan's mountainous soil which lends itself to tillage. In the Nara period, the state nationalized the land and rented it to the peasant for 6 years, or at most till death. But the government discovered that men did not care to improve or properly care for land that might in a short time be assigned to others, and the experiment ended in a restoration of private ownership, with state provision of funds in the spring to finance the planting and reaping of the crops. Despite this aid, the life of the peasant was not one of degenerative ease. His farm was a tiny tract, for even in feudal days 1 square mile had to support 2,000 men. He had to contribute annually to the state 30 days of forced labor, during which death by a spear thrust might be the penalty of a moment's idleness. The government took from him, in taxes and levies of many kinds, 6% of his product in the 7th century, 72% in the 12th, and 40% in the 19th. His tools were of the simplest sort. His clothing was poor and slight in the winter, and usually nothing at all in the summer. His furniture was a rice pot, a few bowls, and some chopsticks. His home was a hut so flimsy that half a week sufficed to build it. Every now and then earthquakes leveled his cottage, or famine emptied his frame. If he worked for another man, his wages, like all wages in Tokugawa Japan, were fixed by the government, but this did not prevent them from being cruelly low. In one of the most famous works of Japanese literature, Kamo Chomei's Hojoki, the author describes, as crowded into the 8 years between 1177 and 1185, an earthquake, a famine, and a fire that almost destroyed Kyoto. His eyewitness account of the famine of 1181 is one of the classic examples of Japanese prose. In all the provinces, people left their lands and sought other parts, or, forgetting their homes, went to live among the hills. All kinds of prayers were begun, and even religious practices which were unusual in ordinary times were revived, but to no purpose whatever. The inhabitants of the capital offered to sacrifice their valuables of all kinds, one after another, for food, but nobody cared to look at them. Beggars swarmed by the roadsides, and our ears were filled with the sound of their lamentations. Everybody was dying of hunger, and as time went on our condition became as desperate as that of the fish in the small pool of the story. At last even respectable-looking people wearing hats and with their feet covered might be seen begging importunately from door to door. Sometimes, while you wondered how such utterly wretched creatures could walk at all, they fell down before your eyes. By garden walls or on the roadsides, countless persons died of famine, and as their bodies were not removed, the world was filled with evil odors. As their bodies changed, there were many sights which the eyes could not endure to see. People who had no means pulled down their houses and sold the materials in the market. It was said that a load for one man was not enough to provide him with sustenance for a single day. It was strange to see among this firewood pieces adorned in places with vermilion or silver or gold leaf. Another very pitiable thing was that when there were a man and a woman who were strongly attached to each other, the one whose love was the greater and whose devotion was the more profound always died first. The reason was that they put themselves last, and whether man or woman gave up to the dearly beloved one anything which they might chance to have begged. As a matter of course, parents died before their children. Again, infants might be seen clinging to the breast of their mother, not knowing that she was already dead. The number of those who died in central Kyoto during the 4th and 5th months alone was 42,300. Contrast with this brutal interlude in the growth of the soil Kampfer's bright picture of Japanese handicrafts as he saw them in the Kyoto of 1691. Kyoto is the great magazine of all Japanese manufactures and commodities, and the chief mercantile town in the empire. There is scarce a house in this large capital where there is not something made or sold. Here they refine copper, coin money, print books, weave the richest stuffs with gold and silver flowers. The best and scarcest dyes, the most artful carvings, all sorts of musical instruments, pictures, japanned cabinets, all sorts of things wrought in gold and other metals, particularly in steel, as the best-tempered blades and other arms, are made here in the utmost perfection, as are also the richest dresses, and after the best fashion. All sorts of toys, puppets moving their heads of themselves, and numberless other things too numerous to be mentioned here. In short, there is nothing that can be thought of but what may be found at Kyoto, and nothing, though ever so neatly wrought, can be imported from abroad but what some artist or other in this capital will undertake to imitate. There are but few houses in all the chief streets where there is not something to be sold, and for my part I could not help admiring whence they can have customers enough for such an immense quantity of goods. All the arts and industries of China had long since been imported into Japan, and as today Japan begins to excel her Western instructors in economy and efficiency of mechanical production, so during the Tokugawa shogunate her handicraftsmen began to rival, and sometimes to excel, the Chinese and Koreans from whom they had learned their art. Most of the work in the manner of medieval Europe was done in the home by families who passed down their occupation and their skill from father to son, and often took the name of their craft. And again, as in our Middle Ages, great guilds were formed, not so much of simple workers as of masters who mercilessly exploited the artisans and zealously restricted the admission of new members to the guilds. One of the most powerful of the guilds was that of the money changers, who accepted deposits, issued vouchers and promissory notes, made loans to commerce, industry, and government, and by 1636 performed all the major functions of finance. Rich merchants and financiers rose to prominence in the cities and began to look with jealous eye upon the exclusive political power of a feudal aristocracy that angered them by scorning the pursuit of gold. Slowly, throughout the Tokugawa era, the mercantile wealth of the nation grew, until at last it was ready to cooperate with American gifts and European guns in bursting the shell of the old Japan. 4. The people. Stature, cosmetics, costume, diet, etiquette, sake, the tea ceremony, the flower ceremony, love of nature, gardens, homes. This most important people in the contemporary political world is modest in stature, averaging 5 feet 3½ inches for the men, 4 feet 10½ inches for the women. One of their great warriors, Tamura Maro, was described as a man of very fine figure, 5 feet 5 inches tall. Some dietitians believe that this brevity is due to insufficiency of lime in the Japanese diet, due in turn to lack of milk, and this to the expensiveness of grazing areas in so crowded a land. But such a theory, like everything in dietetics, must be looked upon as highly hypothetical. The women seem fragile and weak, but probably their energy, like that of the men, is one of nervous courage rather than of physical strength, and cannot be seen outside of emergencies. Their beauty is a matter of expression and carriage as well as of feature. Their dainty grace is a typical product of Japanese art. Cosmetics are popular and ancient in Japan as elsewhere. Even in the early days of Kyoto's leadership, every male of quality rouged his cheeks, powdered his face, sprinkled his clothes with perfume, and carried a mirror with him wherever he went. Powder has been for centuries the female complexion of Japan. The lady Sei Shonagon, in her pillow sketches, circa 991 A.D., says demurely, "I bent my head down and hid my face with my sleeve at the risk of brushing off my powder and appearing with a spotted face." Fashionable ladies rouged their cheeks, colored their nails, and occasionally gilded the lower lip. To complete their toilet, 16 articles were required in the 17th century and 20 in the 18th. They recognized 15 styles of front hair and 12 styles of back hair. They shaved their eyebrows, painted crescent moons or other forms in their place, or substituted for them 2 little black spots high up on the forehead, to match their artificially blackened teeth. To construct the architecture of a woman's hair was a task that took from 2 to 6 hours of expert labor. In the Heian epoch, the majority of the men shaved the crown of the head, gathered the rest in a queue, and laid the queue athwart the crown so as to divide it into equal halves. Beards, though sparse, were a necessity. Those who had none by nature wore false ones, and a pair of tweezers for the care of the beard was furnished to every guest at any fashionable house. Japanese costume in the Nara age imitated the Chinese, with tunic and trousers covered by a tight robe. In the Kyoto period, the robe became looser and multiple. Men as well as women wore from 2 to 20 superimposed robes, whose colors were determined by the rank of the wearer, and provided many prismatic displays at the edges of the sleeves. At one time, the lady's sleeves reached below her knees, and bore each of them a little bell that tinkled as she walked. On days when the streets were wet from rain or snow, they walked on wooden slippers raised by wooden cleats an inch or so above the earth. In the Tokugawa era, dress became so extravagant that the shoguns, careless of history, tried to check it by sumptuary laws. Silk-lined and embroidered breeches and socks were outlawed, beards were forbidden, certain ways of wearing the hair were prescribed, and at times the police were instructed to arrest anyone wearing fine garments in the street. Occasionally these laws were obeyed. For the most part they were circumvented by the ingenuity of human folly. In time, the rage for plural robes abated, and the Japanese became one of the most simply, modestly, and tastefully dressed of peoples. Nor did they yield to any other nation in habits of cleanliness. Among those who could afford it, clothes were changed 3 times a day, and poor as well as rich bathed the body daily. In the villages, the people bathed in tubs outside their doors in summer, while gossiping industriously with their neighbors. Hot baths at 110 degrees Fahrenheit were used as a method of keeping warm in winter. Diet was simple and wholesome until luxury came. The early Chinese descriptions of the Japanese noted that they are a long-lived race, and persons who have reached 100 years are very common. The staple food of the people was rice, to which were added fish, vegetables, seaweed, fruit, and meat according to income. Meat was a rare dish except among the aristocracy and the soldiery. On a regimen of rice, a little fish, and no meat, the coolie developed good lungs and tough muscles, and could run from 50 to 80 miles in 24 hours without distress. When he added meat, he lost this capacity. On the other hand, those Japanese who have adopted a non-physical life while continuing to eat large quantities of rice are succumbing to digestive disorders. The emperors of the Kyoto period made pious efforts to enforce Buddhist dietary laws by forbidding the slaughter or eating of animals. But when the people found that the priests themselves clandestinely violated these laws, they took to meat as a delicacy and used it to excess whenever their means permitted. To the Japanese, as to the Chinese and the French, fine cooking was an essential grace of civilization. Its practitioners, like artists and philosophers, divided into warring schools and fought one another with recipes. Table manners became at least as important as religion. Elaborate enactments prescribed the order and quantity of bites and the posture of the body at each stage of the meal. Ladies were forbidden to make a sound while eating or drinking, but men were expected to indicate their appreciation of a host's generosity by a little grateful belching. The diners sat on 1 or 2 heels on mats, at a table raised but a few inches above the floor, or the food might be laid upon the mat without any table at all. Usually the meal was begun with a hot drink of rice wine, for had not the poet Tahito declared, far back in the 7th century, that sake was the one solution for all the problems of life? That which the 7 sages sought,
those men of olden times, was sake beyond all doubt. Instead of holding forth wisely with grave mien, how much better to drink sake, to get drunk, and to shout aloud. Since it is true that death comes at last for all, let us be joyful while we are alive. Even the jewel that sparkles in the night is less to us than the uplifting of the heart which comes by drinking sake. More sacred than sake to the aristocracy was tea. This gracious remedy for the tastelessness of boiled water was introduced from China into Japan, unsuccessfully in 805, successfully in 1191. At first the people shunned the leaf as a poison and would have nothing to do with it. But when a few cups of the outlandish beverage quickly cleared the head of a shogun who had drunk too much sake the night before, the Japanese recognized the utility of tea. Its costliness added to its charm. Tiny jars of it were given as precious gifts, even to reward warriors for mighty deeds of valor, and the fortunate possessors gathered their friends about them to share the royal drink. The Japanese made a graceful and complex ceremony out of tea drinking, and Rikyu established for it 6 inviolable rules that raised it to a cult. The signal bidding the guests to enter the tea pavilion, said Rikyu, must be given by wooden clappers. The ablution bowl must be kept constantly filled with pure water. Any guest conscious of inadequacy or inelegance in the furniture or the surroundings must leave at once, and as quietly as possible. No trivial gossip was to be indulged in, but only matters of noble and serious import were to be discussed. No word of deceit or flattery should pass any lip, and the affair should not last beyond 4 hours. No teapot was used at such cha-no-yu, hot water for tea, reunions. Powdered tea was placed in a cup of choice design, hot water was added, and the cup was passed from guest to guest, each wiping its rim carefully with a napkin. When the last drinker had consumed the last drop, the cup was passed around again, to be critically examined as a work of ceramic art. In this way the tea ceremony stimulated the potters to produce ever lovelier cups and bowls, and helped to form the manners of the Japanese into tranquility, courtesy, and charm. Flowers, too, became a cult in Japan, and the same Rikyu who formulated the ritual of tea valued his flowers as much as his cups. When he heard that Hideyoshi was coming to see his famous collection of chrysanthemums, Rikyu destroyed all the blossoms in his garden but one, so that this might shine unrivaled before the terrible shogun. The art of flower arrangement grew step by step with teaism in the 15th and 16th centuries, and became in the 17th an independent devotion. Flower masters arose who taught men and women how flowers should be grown in the garden and placed in the home. It was not enough, they said, to admire the blossoms, but one must learn to see as much loveliness in the leaf, the bough, or the stalk as in the flower, as much beauty in one flower as in 1,000, and one must arrange them with a view not merely to color, but to grouping and line. Tea, flowers, poetry, and the dance became requisites of womanhood among the aristocracy of Japan. Flowers are the religion of the Japanese. They worship them with sacrificial fervor and national accord. They watch for the blossoms appropriate to each season, and when, for a week or two in April, the cherry tree blooms, all Japan seems to leave its work to gaze at it, or even to make pilgrimages to places where the miracle is most abundant and complete. Similar pilgrimages are made to see the maple leaves turning in the fall. The cherry tree is cultivated not for any fruit, but for its blossom, the emblem of the faithful warrior ready to die for his country at the moment of his fullest life. Criminals en route to execution will sometimes ask for a flower. The Lady Chiyo, in a famous poem, tells of a girl who came to draw water from a well, but finding bucket and rope entwined with convolvuli, went elsewhere for water rather than break the tendrils. The heart of man, says Tsurayuki, can never be understood, but in my native village the flowers give forth their perfume as before. These simple lines are among the greatest of Japanese poems, for they express in perfect and irreducible form a profound characteristic of a race, and one of the rare conclusions of philosophy. Never has another people shown such love of nature as one finds in Japan. Nowhere else have men and women accepted so completely all natural moods of earth, sky, and sea. Nowhere else have men so carefully cultivated gardens, or nourished plants in their growth, or tended them in the home. Japan did not have to wait for a Rousseau or a Wordsworth to tell it that mountains were sublime or that lakes might be beautiful. There is hardly a dwelling in Japan without a vase of flowers in it, and hardly a poem in Japanese literature without a landscape in its lines. As Oscar Wilde thought that England should not fight France because the French wrote perfect prose, so America might seek peace to the end with a nation that thirsts for beauty almost as passionately as it hungers for power. The art of gardening was imported from China, along with Buddhism and tea, but here again the Japanese transformed creatively what they had absorbed through imitation. They found an aesthetic value in asymmetry, a new charm in the surprises of unhackneyed forms. They dwarfed trees and shrubs by confining their roots in pots, and with impish humor and tyrannical affection trained them into shapes that might within a garden wall represent the wind-twisted trees of stormy Japan. They searched the craters of their volcanoes and the most precipitous shores of their seas to find rocks fused into metal by hidden fires, or molded by patient breakers into quaint and gnarled forms. They dug little lakes, channeled roving rivulets, and crossed them with bridges that seemed to spring from the natural growth of the woods. And through all these varied formations they wore, with imperceptible design, footpaths that would lead now to startling novelties, and now to cool and silent retreats. Where space and means allowed, they attached their homes to their gardens rather than their gardens to their homes. Their houses were frail but pretty. Earthquakes made tall buildings dangerous, but the carpenter and woodworker knew how to bind eaves, gables, and lattices into a dwelling aesthetically simple, aesthetically perfect, and architecturally unique. Here were no curtains, sofas, beds, tables, or chairs, no obtrusive display of the dweller's wealth and luxury, no museum of pictures, statuary, or bric-a-brac, but in some alcove a blossoming branch, on the wall a silk or paper painting or specimen of calligraphy, on the matted floor a cushion fronted by a lectern and flanked by a bookcase on one side and an armrest on the other, and hidden in a cupboard mattresses and coverings to be spread on the floor when the time should come to sleep. Within such modest quarters, or in the peasant's fragile hut, the Japanese family lived, and through all storms of war and revolution, of political corruption and religious strife, carried on the life and civilization of the Sacred Isles. 5. The family. The paternal autocrat, the status of woman, children, sexual morality, the geisha, love. For the real source of social order, in the Orient even more than in the West, was the family, and the omnipotence of the father, in Japan as throughout the East, expressed not a backward condition of society, but a preference for familial rather than political government. The individual was less important in the East than in the Occident because the state was weaker and required a strongly organized and disciplined family to take the place of a far-reaching and pervasive central authority. Freedom was conceived in terms of the family rather than of the individual, for, the family being the economic unit of production as well as the social unit of order, success or failure, survival or death came not to the separate person but to the family. The power of the father was tyrannical, but it had the painless grace of seeming natural, necessary, and human. He could dismiss a son-in-law or a daughter-in-law from the patriarchal household while keeping the grandchildren with him. He could kill a child convicted of unchastity or a serious crime. He could sell his children into slavery or prostitution. And he could divorce his wife with a word. If he was a simple commoner, he was expected to be monogamous, but if he belonged to the higher classes, he was entitled to keep concubines, and no notice was to be taken of his occasional infidelities. When Christianity entered Japan, native writers complained that it disturbed the peace of families by insinuating that concubinage and adultery were sins. As in China, the position of woman was higher in the earlier than in the later stages of the civilization. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.